Nelson Hawkins knelt beside the small girl and looked up at her mother with eyes that carried the full weight of what he was about to say. Maria Hale stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek Marshal's office, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her jaw set in that particular way she held herself when she was trying not to break. The afternoon sun cut hard through the window and threw a bar of gold across the floorboards between them. Outside, the town of Dusty Creek hummed along as if nothing mattered, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. The little girl, Clara Hale, was 6 years old, and she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. And right now those dark eyes were watching Nelson with the open, terrifying trust that only a child can offer a person they have decided to love. She had come to love Nelson over the past 3 months. She had started calling him Marshal Nelson instead of just Marshal Hawkins. She had started saving him the last biscuit at supper when Maria invited him to eat with them. She had started drawing him pictures of horses because she knew he loved horses. And now Maria had told her they were leaving. She had told her they were going back to Santa Fe, back to her aunt's house, back to the life they had before Dusty Creek and before Nelson Hawkins. Clara hadn't cried. She had simply gone very still in the way that children do when they understand something that hurts too much to protest. Nelson looked at the child's face, and then he looked up at Maria, and something raw and desperate moved across his features. He was not a man who used words carelessly. He had spent years measuring every word before he let it out into the world. But now, he let this one out without measuring it at all. "You deserve a man who stays this time," he said quietly, and the words were aimed at Clara, but they landed in Maria's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings all the way out to the edges of her. Maria's throat closed, because those were the exact words she had said to herself the night she had packed their bags. Those were the exact words she had used as her armor against the terrifying pull she felt toward this man. She had told herself that she was protecting Clara. She had told herself that the pattern was already written, that men in this territory did not stay, that lawmen especially did not stay because the work had a way of claiming them, and she was not willing to let her daughter love another man who would either leave or be taken. But Nelson Hawkins was saying it back to her now, and his voice was not accusatory. It was not a trap. It was something much more dangerous than that. It was the truth spoken by a man who understood exactly what it cost her. She had not told him she was leaving until this morning. She had written out the letter she planned to leave, then burned it. She had written a second one, then walked it over to the office herself, because she was not the kind of woman who disappeared in the night. She owed him more than that. She had thought she could hand him the letter, say a clean goodbye, and walk away with her daughter and her broken heart intact. She had not accounted for the fact that Clara would run ahead of her into the office and throw her arms around Nelson's legs the moment she saw him. She had not accounted for the fact that Nelson would kneel down, and that the sight of this enormous, quiet, gentle man crouching to a child's level would completely undo her. To understand how they had arrived at this doorway, at this impossible moment, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to the morning 4 months ago when Maria Hale had ridden into Dusty Creek on a borrowed wagon, with everything she owned packed in 2 trunks and a cotton sack, and a 5-year-old daughter asleep in the wagon bed behind her, and a secret that she had been carrying for 3 years like a stone sewn into the lining of her coat. The year was 1882. The New Mexico Territory was a place that was still deciding what it wanted to be. A patchwork of cattle ranges and railroad outposts and small towns that sprang up around a water source or a trade route and either grew or died within a decade. Dusty Creek had grown. It sat on a tributary of the Canadian River and had a general store, a hotel, a church that also served as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a saloon, a doctor's office, and a marshal's office that had been occupied by Nelson Hawkins for 6 years. Maria had come to Dusty Creek because her cousin, a woman named Dolores Vega, had written her a letter saying there was work at the hotel and that the town was safe, and that the Marshal kept the peace better than any man she had ever seen. Maria had come because Santa Fe held too many memories she could not afford, and because Clara needed stability, and because Maria herself was 28 years old and exhausted in a way that went all the way to her bones. She had not come looking for love. She had, in fact, specifically decided against love. Love was a trap she had already walked into once, and the cost of it had been enormous. Her husband, Robert Hale, had been a charming man. He had been the kind of man who filled up a room when he walked into it, who laughed loudly, and spent money freely and made promises with the ease of someone who had never had to keep one. Maria had loved him with the full, unguarded love of a 22-year-old woman who did not yet understand that charm and character were different things. They had married in Santa Fe in the spring of 1876, and Clara had been born in 1876, and by the spring of 1878, Robert Hale had walked out of their small adobe house with a traveling bag and a vague excuse about work in Colorado, and he had never come back. He had not died. He had simply gone. Maria had eventually received a letter, nearly a year after his departure, informing her that he had taken up with a widow in Denver and that he supposed their marriage was over. The letter had included no money and no apology, just the information, delivered with the casual indifference of a man who had already moved on and could not understand why she would not do the same. Maria had done what she had to do. She had worked at her aunt's dry goods store in Santa Fe. She had raised Clara with the help of her family. She had built a life out of the rubble of that first one, but the experience had done something to her that she could not fully undo. It had built walls, high and practical walls, and behind those walls she had filed away any hope of finding a man worth trusting with her heart or her daughters. And then she had arrived in Dusty Creek. Nelson Hawkins was not what she had expected from the word Marshal. She had expected someone hard-edged and loud, the kind of man who wore his authority like a weapon. What she found instead was a tall, broad-shouldered man of 34 with a weathered face and calm brown eyes, and an unhurried way of moving through the world that suggested he had made a private peace with it a long time ago. He wore his badge without ceremony. He spoke to everyone in town with the same level, respectful attention, whether they were the banker or the man sleeping off a night of drinking in the alley behind the saloon. The first time Maria met him, she was 3 hours arrived in Dusty Creek and had gotten turned around trying to find the hotel from the livery stable. She was walking down the main street with Clara on her hip and her cotton sack over her shoulder, and she stopped at the marshal's office to ask directions because she could read the sign, and because a lawman seemed like a safer person to ask than a stranger. Nelson had been sitting outside the office on a straight-backed wooden chair, reading a letter. He had folded the letter immediately when she approached, stood up, and answered her question. Then he had offered to carry her cotton sack, and when she hesitated, because she was a woman who did not accept help easily, he had simply said that he was walking that direction anyway, and it seemed a shame to let a heavy bag walk itself when there were 2 free hands available. She had given him the bag. He had walked them to the hotel, introduced her to the proprietor by name, made sure she was settled, and then said goodbye to both her and Clara with a grave politeness that somehow managed to be warm at the same time. He had tipped his hat. He had walked back the way he came. Maria had stood in the hotel doorway and watched him go and told herself firmly that she was not interested, that she had noticed nothing, that he was simply a man doing his job. She had noticed everything. Over the following weeks, Dusty Creek revealed itself to her in layers. The hotel work was steady and not unpleasant. She managed the front desk in the mornings and helped with laundry in the afternoons. Clara attended the schoolhouse 3 mornings a week, which was taught by a patient young woman named Miss Crane, and spent the other mornings with dolers, who had become the kind of warm, noisy aunt that Clara loved instinctively. Nelson Hawkins was a fixture of the town in a way that was impossible to ignore. He took his morning coffee at the same time each day at the small counter in the general store. He walked the length of the main street morning and evening, not in a patrolling way, more in the manner of a man who understood that visible calm was itself a form of keeping the peace. He settled disputes between neighbors with a patience that Maria found quietly remarkable, listening to both sides completely before speaking. And when he did speak, it was with a fairness that left people unable to argue even when they disagreed. She watched him from a professional distance for 2 weeks before she spoke to him again, and that was only because Clara pulled her over to him in front of the general store one morning and announced very seriously that she had drawn him a picture. It was a horse, or approximately a horse, rendered in pencil on the back of a paper bag, with legs that were of varying lengths and ears that suggested the animal was in some kind of distress. Nelson had taken the picture with both hands, studied it for a long moment with complete attention, and said that it was the finest horse he had seen in some time, and that he was going to put it up in his office. He had, in fact, done exactly that. Maria had seen it there 3 days later when she had occasion to go to the office on behalf of the hotel regarding a noise complaint from a guest. The picture was pinned to the wall above his desk. She had not said anything about it, but she had felt something shift inside her, quiet and alarming. The first real conversation they had was 4 weeks into her time in Dusty Creek, and it happened because of rain. A sudden summer storm had blown in from the west in the mid-afternoon, the kind that turned the main street into a river of red mud in 20 minutes and sent everyone scrambling for cover. Maria had been returning from dropping Clara at Dollar's house and had been caught on the wrong side of town. She had taken shelter in the alcove of the marshal's office door, and Nelson had opened the door and told her to come inside, because standing in an alcove in a storm seemed unnecessary when there was a room with a stove and 2 chairs. They had talked for an hour while the rain hammered the roof. He had asked her about Santa Fe in the careful way of someone who was interested, but did not want to pry. She had told him about working at her aunt's store, about the cathedral square, about the color of the light in the evenings there. She had not told him about Robert. She had not told him about the letter, but she had told him that she was not sure Dusty Creek was permanent, that she took things 1 month at a time now, which was a form of honesty even if it was not the whole truth. He had nodded. "That's a reasonable way to live," he had said. "It's how most people out here survive." She had asked him how long he had been marshal. 6 years, he said. "You like it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm good at it," he said finally. Liking and being good at something aren't always the same thing. She had looked at him then, really looked at him. "What would you rather be doing?" Another pause. "I had a piece of land about 12 miles northeast of here. Ran some cattle on it for a year before the town needed a marshal and I took the job. I think about it sometimes. The land's still mine. I pay a man to run a few head on it, keep the grass down. You want to go back to it?" It was not really a question, and he did not treat it as one. He just looked out the window at the rain and said, "Someday." That one word, someday, had landed somewhere complicated inside her. Because someday was not a threat and it was not a promise, and the uncertainty of it felt both safe and terrifying. The storm ended. She had thanked him and gone to collect Clara from Dollar's. She had walked home with her daughter's hand in hers and told herself very firmly that she was not falling in love with the marshal of Dusty Creek. But she was. She was falling precisely and helplessly, in the way that grown people fall when they are not looking for it, and have spent years building walls specifically to prevent it. It was falling not in the dramatic, crashing way of young romance, but in the slow, devastating way of something that has been decided by parts of you that do not consult your good sense. The next 6 weeks brought them closer in the careful, incremental way that adults who are both afraid of being hurt move together. He began stopping by the hotel in the evenings when his shift was done, not as an official visit, simply as a neighbor coming by. Maria would sometimes have a cup of coffee going, and she would pour him one, and they would sit in the small parlor behind the front desk where Clara was usually drawing or playing quietly on the rug, and they would talk. They talked about everything except the things that mattered most. They talked about the railroad line that was coming through the eastern part of the territory, and what it would mean for towns like Dusty Creek. They talked about books, and she was surprised to discover that he had read widely, that the shelves in his office held more volumes than she would have expected from a lawman in a small frontier town. They talked about Clara's drawings, which had expanded to include not just horses, but also scenes of apparent epic drama that Clara narrated to them with great seriousness. And slowly, without either of them having planned it, they began to build something between them that felt dangerously and beautifully like trust. Clara adored him. This was, for Maria, the most frightening part. Because her daughter had not known her father and had not had a man in her life who was a consistent, gentle presence. She had Maria, who was wonderful, and Dolores, who was wonderful, and her grandmother in Santa Fe, who was wonderful. But Clara had been watching the world for someone to fill a particular shape in it, and Nelson Hawkins fit that shape in a way that made Maria's protective instincts flare up even as her heart opened. The night that changed everything came in the form of a man named Curtis Brody. Curtis Brody rode into Dusty Creek on a Thursday evening in late summer, and Maria knew him the moment she saw him from the hotel window. She knew him because she had seen him before, twice, in Santa Fe, in the company of Robert Hale. He had been Robert's friend of a sort, the kind of friend that men like Robert kept, men who made their money in ways that moved just at the edge of legal. She did not know why Curtis Brody was in Dusty Creek, but she knew it could not be coincidence, and the cold, crawling certainty that settled over her told her that the dark past she had carried out of Santa Fe had found her. She told herself she was being paranoid. She went back to her work and told herself that men traveled through the territory all the time and that the world was full of coincidences. But then Brody came to the hotel and asked for a room, and when he signed the register, he looked up at her with a smile that knew too much. "Maria Hale," he said, "I had a feeling I'd find you here." She kept her face composed through years of practice. "Mr. Brody, welcome to the Dusty Creek Hotel." She gave him his room key and waited until he was up the stairs before she let herself exhale. That night she told Dolores everything. Not just about Brody, but the piece of the story she had been keeping locked away. 3 months before she left Santa Fe, Maria had come into possession of information about Robert Hale's activities in Colorado that was extremely dangerous. She had not gone looking for it. A man, one of Robert's creditors who had been cheated, had come to her in desperation, thinking she might know where Robert was, and in the course of explaining his situation, had let slip that Robert was involved in a land fraud scheme that had taken money from a number of territorial investors, and that there were documents, letters and contracts that proved it. The man had been frightened for his life. He had left Santa Fe 2 days later. Maria had never seen him again. But the documents existed, and before he left, the man had pressed a sealed envelope into her hands and told her to keep it safe and that someday it might matter. She had kept it. She had carried it across the territory to Dusty Creek, sewn into the lining of her traveling trunk because she had not known what else to do with it, and because burning it had seemed dangerous in a different way. Robert's associates, she understood now, wanted that envelope. Dolores listened to all of this with her hands folded on the table and a face that went very still. Then she said, "You need to tell Nelson." Maria said nothing. "Maria," Dolores said. "He is the marshal," Maria said, as if this were a reason not to tell him. "That is exactly why you need to tell him." She went to the marshal's office the next morning before the town was properly awake. Nelson was already there, as he always was, drinking his first coffee and reading a report that had come in from the territorial office. He looked up when she came in, and whatever he saw in her face made him set the report down immediately. She told him. Not all of it at first, but enough. She told him about Robert, about the desertion, about Brody and his connection to Robert. She told him about the man in Santa Fe and the envelope. She watched Nelson's face while she talked, and it did not change in the way she feared. It did not fill with the kind of judgment that she had braced herself for. It grew more attentive, more focused, the way a man's face goes when he is listening with his whole self. When she finished, he said, "Do you have the envelope with you?" "No, it's at the hotel in my trunk." "Go get it," he said. "Bring it here, and stay here until I tell you it's safe to go back." The word safe was not a word she had associated with anyone else's authority over her life in a very long time. Something in her wanted to argue, to insist she could handle it herself. But another part of her, the part that had been carrying the weight alone for 3 years, was so tired that she simply stood up and went to get the envelope. The documents inside were exactly what the man in Santa Fe had described. Nelson spent an hour reading through them with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. The scheme was a land fraud, yes, but it was bigger than a simple fraud. It had connections to a railroad contract bid that had been corrupted, money that had been diverted from legitimate investors into the pockets of men who operated under assumed names. Robert Hale's name appeared in it, but he was not the center of it. He was a smaller piece of a larger mechanism. The larger mechanism had a name that Nelson clearly recognized, because his expression changed when he reached that page. He sat back in his chair and looked at her. "Do you know a man named Harlan Voss?" he asked. She did not. "He's been wanted by the territorial marshal's office for 2 years, Nelson said. For fraud, for extortion, and in connection with the murder of a federal land agent in Albuquerque in 1880. These documents connect him directly to the railroad contract fraud." He held up the papers. "This is evidence that people have been killed to suppress Maria." The scale of what she had been carrying settled over her like a cold weight. "Brody works for Voss," Nelson continued. "He's not here for Robert's sake, he's here for these." The fear that came up in her then was clean and sharp. It was not the vague, anxious fear she had been living with for 3 years, but a specific, immediate danger, and oddly that made it easier to manage. A specific danger had specific responses. "What do we do?" she asked. "I need to get a message to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe," he said. "That will take 3 days at minimum. In the meantime, Brody cannot know that I have these documents or that you've spoken to me. Can you go back to the hotel and act as if nothing has changed?" She looked at him. "I managed 3 years of that," she said quietly. "I think I can manage 3 days." Something moved in his eyes. It might have been admiration. It might have been something else. She went back to the hotel. She worked her shift. She was polite and efficient when Brody came down for his breakfast, and she did not let her hands tremble. Clara was at Dollar's house, which was a mercy, because Maria could not have maintained her composure with her daughter nearby, asking questions with those sharp, dark eyes. Nelson moved quietly. He sent his deputy, a young man named Ed Talbot, to Santa Fe with the message to the territorial office. He began inquiring discreetly about Brody, about whether anyone else had come to town with him or was expected. He found that a second man had arrived the previous evening and taken a room at the opposite end of town, at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Greer. The second man had given his name as Thomas Webb, but his description matched a known associate of Harlan Voss. The situation had edges that could turn sharp very quickly, and Nelson moved to control them with the steady precision that Maria had come to associate with him. He was not a man who operated from fear or from bluster. He operated from a complete, unsentimental understanding of the situation in front of him. On the second night, he came to the hotel just before the desk closed and asked if she could sit with him in the parlor for a few minutes. She sent the night man to lock up the front and sat down across from Nelson in the small parlor with its oil lamp and its 2 worn chairs, and he told her that a third man had arrived, and that he was now fairly certain they were waiting for a fourth, who he believed was Harlan Voss himself. "They won't move until Voss arrives," he said, "which gives us a window." "A window for what? For you to not be here when they do move." She looked at him steadily. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to be safe," he said, and the distinction was important. "If I leave, Brody will know something has happened. He'll come for you directly." "That's a problem I'm equipped to handle," Nelson said. "And Clara," she asked. "Where do I take Clara?" "To Dollars. Her house is on the south side of town and easily watchable. Ed Talbot's wife is there now. She volunteered. You could stay there too." She sat with this for a moment. "You planned all of this," she said. "It seemed like the responsible thing to do," he said. She looked at his face in the lamplight. He was not a handsome man in the conventional way, but his face was one that had been built by something more than time, by decisions made with integrity, by a life conducted close to its own truth. She found him beautiful in a way that was specific to him and could not be replicated. "Nelson," she said. He looked at her. "Why?" she asked. The word held everything she could not yet say. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them threw gold light across the space where words should have been. "Because some things matter more than the job," he said finally. She understood what that meant. She understood it in every place in herself, where she had tried to build a wall against exactly this kind of understanding. She went to Dollar's house that night with Clara, who complained briefly about being woken up, and then fell back asleep with her head on Maria's shoulder within 2 minutes of the wagon moving. Nelson handled the next 2 days with a skill that she would only understand fully afterward, when the pieces had been assembled. He contacted the local judge. He gathered statements. He coordinated with the 2 deputies who rode the wider circuit between towns. When Harlan Voss arrived on the 3rd day, he rode into a situation that had been carefully and quietly transformed from a trap into a net. Voss was arrested at the hotel by Nelson personally, with 2 deputies behind him, before Brody or Webb even knew what was happening. Brody was detained an hour later at the boarding house. Webb had apparently sensed something and had already ridden south, but the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe had been alerted, and he was arrested at a staging post on the road 2 days later. The documents Maria had carried for 3 years became the centerpiece of a territorial prosecution that would eventually send Harlan Voss to prison for 14 years. Robert Hale, when contacted by territorial authorities in Denver, cooperated in exchange for leniency and was assessed a fine and a prohibition from territorial business. He was, by all accounts, thoroughly and properly diminished. Maria did not feel triumphant about this. She felt mostly the extraordinary lightness of something she had been carrying being set down. The morning after the arrests, she walked to the marshal's office and found Nelson at his desk, writing his official report. He looked tired in the clean way of someone who has done what needed to be done. She brought him coffee from the hotel kitchen and sat down in the chair across from his desk. "It's over," she said. "The legal part," he said. "There'll be testimony and hearings to follow, but you're safe." She sat with the word safe again. It fitted differently now. It fitted not like a cage, but like solid ground under her feet. "I owe you more than I know how to say," she told him. "You don't owe me anything," he said, and he said it the way he said everything important, plainly and without performance. "You carried that by yourself for 3 years. That's not nothing." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I'm not good at accepting help," she said. "I think I need to practice it." When she looked up, he was watching her with an expression that was so carefully restrained that she could see exactly how much effort the restraint was costing him. And something broke open in her at the sight of it. Because a man who felt deeply and held it back with that much care was a man who understood what feelings cost, and that understanding was something she recognized, because it was something she knew about herself. She stood up. She had not planned to say what she said next. She had not made any kind of decision. It simply came out of her, the way things come out when you have held them long enough. "I think," she said, "that I would like to have supper with you tonight." "Not at the hotel. I would like to cook supper at Dollar's, where there is a proper stove, and I would like for you to come and for Clara to be there and for it to not be a professional visit or a strategic discussion. I would like it to simply be supper." Nelson looked at her for a moment. "I would like that very much," he said. The supper was simple because Maria was a practical cook and Dollar's kitchen was not extravagant. She made a bean stew with dried chilies and cornbread, and there was a small jar of preserved peaches for dessert that Dolores had been saving for a special occasion. And Dolores apparently decided without being asked that this was that occasion. Clara sat between Nelson and Maria at the table and told Nelson at great length about the horse she was currently drawing, which was going to be more accurate than the previous one, because she had studied the horses at the livery stable very carefully. Nelson asked her questions about the horse with the same grave attention he had given the first drawing. Maria watched him across the table and felt something settle in her chest with a permanence that was terrifying and right all at once. Dolores, who was not a subtle woman, found excuses to be in other parts of the house for most of the meal, which both Maria and Nelson pretended not to notice. After supper, when Clara had been put to bed on Dolores' settle with a quilt, Maria and Nelson sat on the porch in the cooling evening air and talked for a long time about nothing urgent and about everything real. She told him more about her marriage, about Robert, about the way hope had been a thing she had dismantled piece by piece and stored away because the cost of it had been too high. He listened without interrupting. And then, when she had finished, he told her something he had not told many people. He had been engaged once 7 years ago to a woman in Texas. Her name was Catherine. She had been a schoolteacher, intelligent and warm and full of plans. She had died of fever the winter before their wedding. He had come to New Mexico the following spring, taken the marshal's job in Dusty Creek, and had been here since. He said this simply, without drama, but the weight of it was clear in the space around the words. "You stayed," Maria said. He looked at her. "Where would I go?" She understood what he was really saying. He had stayed in Dusty Creek because he had needed the purpose it gave him. He had stayed because leaving and staying and loving were things he took seriously, in a way that some people never did. "My daughter loves you," she said. "I know," he said. "That frightens me. I know that too." She looked out at the dark street, at the stars that were thick and close in the way they only were in places far from city lights. "I have made very poor decisions about men," she said. "From what you've told me," he said, "you made one poor decision about one poor man when you were too young and too kind to see what he was. That's not a pattern, that's a misfortune." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Say the exact thing that makes the wall I've spent years building feel unnecessary." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his face was open in a way she had never seen on it before. "Because it is unnecessary," he said, "with me." She believed him. God help her, she believed him. Not blindly, not the way she had believed Robert, with the unexamined faith of a woman who had not yet been hurt. She believed Nelson the way you believe a thing when you have watched it be true in every small and large way over months of careful observation. She believed him with her eyes open. She did not lean over and kiss him that night. They were too careful for that, both of them, too aware of what it would mean and too respectful of each other to treat it as a small thing. Instead, he took her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and she did not move it away, and they sat like that for a long while in the dark. The following weeks were a revelation to Maria. She had not understood, until she allowed herself to stop fighting it, how deeply she had wanted this. She had been so intent on protecting herself and Clara that she had not let herself feel the full weight of what she had been refusing. Now that she allowed it, it came in on her like a wave she could no longer outrun. They walked together in the evenings when his shift was done. Clara came too, running ahead of them on the path by the creek, completely unself-conscious in her joy. Nelson bought her a small wooden horse at the general store, painted brown with a painted saddle. Clara named it Marshal and took it everywhere. Maria began to let herself imagine things she had not let herself imagine. She imagined the land 12 miles northeast of Dusty Creek that Nelson had described. She imagined the house that might stand on it. She imagined mornings without a front desk to manage and evenings without calculations about how long the money in her account would last. She imagined being chosen by someone who had seen all of her, including the frightened parts, and had chosen her anyway. And then the letter arrived. It came in the weekly mail packet from Santa Fe, addressed to Maria Hale in a handwriting she had not seen in 4 years. Robert's handwriting. She stood at the hotel desk and looked at her own name in his hand and felt a surge of something that was not love and not even anger exactly, but a kind of exhausted dread. He had not written in 4 years. The territorial authorities must have been in contact with him about the Voss case, and now he was writing. She opened it. She read it standing there at the desk. It took less than 2 minutes because it was not a long letter. Robert, it appeared, had experienced something he described as a reckoning. His dealings with Harlan Voss and the subsequent investigation had cost him his position in Denver, his savings, and the widow with whom he had built his new life, who had left him upon hearing what he had been involved in. He was, he wrote, humbled. He was, he wrote, deeply sorry for what he had done to Maria and to Clara. He wanted, he wrote, to come and see his daughter. He understood if Maria refused, but he hoped she would not. He hoped they might talk. He hoped, the letter ended, that it was not too late for him to do right by both of them. Maria folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She went through the rest of her shift with her face calm and her mind turning the letter over and over like a stone in a riverbed. That evening, she did not go to meet Nelson. She sent a note with the hotel boy saying she was not feeling well. She sat in her room with Clara and watched her daughter play with the wooden horse, and the gut-deep fear came back, the old one, the specific fear she had built her walls against. What if Nelson left? Not the way Robert had left, with indifference and selfishness. But left nevertheless. The Marshal's life was not without risk. He had handled Harlan Voss and his associates without anyone being hurt, but she knew, because she was not naive, that not every confrontation resolved that cleanly. She knew what it meant to love a man in a dangerous profession in a territory that was still raw and ungoverned in too many of its corners. And she knew what it meant for Clara. Clara, who had already attached herself to Nelson with the complete trust of a child who had found something she had been looking for. If Maria continued on this path and something happened, if Nelson were hurt or killed or simply decided he was not willing to take on a woman with a child and a complicated past, Clara would be devastated in a way that would mark her. The walls came back up. They came back up fast and with the full force of 3 years of defensive architecture. She wrote a letter to Robert that night. Not a welcoming letter, but a considered one. She told him that he could write to Clara when Clara was older and able to understand the correspondence. She told him that she was not prepared to expose Clara to a man who had abandoned her, not until considerable time had passed and considerable proof of change had been demonstrated. She told him she wished him well and meant it, because she was not a cruel person, but she told him also that his choices had consequences and that she and Clara were 2 of them. She sealed the letter and addressed it and left it at the front desk to go in the next mail packet. Then she sat up most of the night looking at her sealing and arriving, by the slow, terrible logic of fear, at a decision that she already knew was wrong even as she made it. She would leave Dusty Creek. She would go back to Santa Fe. The legal business with Voss would require some testimony from her, yes, but that could be managed by letter or by a short trip. She and Clara did not need to stay. Clara would be sad, and then she would recover because children recovered because Maria had made sure that Clara was strong enough to recover. Better to go now before it went further. Better to pull back while it was still, technically, possible. Better to protect her daughter. She told Dollars the next morning. Dollars, as expected, was not gentle about her response. "You are afraid," Dollars said. "I am practical." "You are afraid," Dollars said again, in the implacable way she had when she knew something to be true. "Maria. That man is not Robert. I know he is not Robert. Then why are you punishing him for what Robert did?" Maria opened her mouth and closed it again. "You are the bravest woman I know," Dollars said. "You carried those papers for 3 years. You rode into a new territory alone with a child. You built your life twice. But you are letting Robert's cowardice become your own, and that is the one thing I will not watch you do." Maria felt the truth of this like a burn. But the fear was very old and very strong, and she could not untangle it in one morning's conversation, and she said she needed time, and Dolores said she understood, but her eyes said she did not quite believe it. 2 days later, Maria booked the wagon and told Clara they were going to visit Santa Fe. Clara, who had been told Santa Fe meant grandma and cousins and the cathedral square, was initially enthusiastic. She had packed her bag with great industry, including the wooden horse, whom she said needed to see the world. And then, on the morning they were to leave, Clara had run ahead into the marshal's office to say goodbye and thrown her arms around Nelson's legs, and Nelson had knelt down, and Maria had stood in the doorway, and the story had come back around to where it began. Nelson looked up at her from his crouched position beside Clara and said, "You deserve a man who stays this time." And the words hit Maria with the full force of a man who understood exactly what her history was and what her fear was and what she had been telling herself, and who refused, gently and completely, to let the false story win without saying so. Maria's throat worked. She could not speak for a moment. Clara looked between the two adults with the sharp attention of a child who understands that something important is happening without knowing precisely what. "Are you sad, Marshal Nelson?" Clara asked. Nelson looked at the little girl. "A little," he said honestly. "Why are you sad?" He considered this for a moment with the care he gave everything. "Because I'm going to miss you," he said. "Both of you." Clara turned to her mother with the full expectation of a child who believes that problems have solutions. "Can we not go?" she asked. Maria's eyes were burning. She was furious with herself for letting them burn, and she was furious with the fear. And she was furious with Robert Hale for having made her so afraid. And somewhere beneath all of that fury was the knowledge that Dolores was right, and that she had known Dolores was right the moment Dolores had said it. She walked into the office. She stood in front of Nelson, who was still crouching beside Clara and who now stood up to his full height, and she looked at him and said the only true thing she could find. "I am terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't know how to stop being terrified." "You don't have to stop," he said. "You just have to decide what you do with it." Clara, sensing that this was a grown-up moment of some significance, sat down quietly on the chair by the desk and studied the wooden horse with great intensity. Maria said, "What are you asking me, Nelson?" "I'm not asking you anything," he said. "I'm just telling you the truth. You deserve someone who stays. Clara deserves that." "I'm not going anywhere." He paused. "That's not a threat and it's not a promise I'm making to pressure you. It's just a fact. I have been here for 6 years and I intend to be here. And whatever you decide, that remains true." She looked at him. She looked at this man who had read fraudulent land documents with the same careful attention he gave horse pictures drawn by a child. This man who had walked her to the hotel on her first day and carried her bag. This man who had sat with her in a rainstorm and talked about the difference between liking and being good at something. This man who had done everything right without ever making her feel that she owed him anything for it. She said, "The wagon is already paid for." He almost smiled. "Ed Talbot's wife needs a wagon to go to her sister's place in Roswell next week. I imagine she'd make good use of it." Maria stood at the edge of the decision for one more moment. She was looking at the picture of Clara's horse, which was still pinned to the wall above his desk. It had been there for 3 months. He had put it there and it had stayed there. She stepped back from the edge and she did not fall. She landed. "I would like," she said with a steadiness that surprised her, "to unpack." Nelson looked at her. "The trunks are in the wagon," she said. "I would like to unpack them." He let out a breath that was deep and slow, the breath of a man who has been holding something very carefully for a very long time. Clara looked up from her wooden horse. "Are we staying?" she asked. "We are staying," Maria said. Clara slid off the chair and went to her mother and put her hand into Maria's hand with perfect simplicity. Then she looked at Nelson. "You should come for supper," she said. "Mama made the bean stew again and it is very good." "I know it is," Nelson said. "I'd be glad to come." What followed was not a sudden and uncomplicated happiness. Maria did not become unafraid overnight. The walls did not come down all at once but were taken apart brick by brick over the following months, each brick a small act of trust, each act of trust made possible by Nelson's absolute steadiness. He was not a demonstrative man by temperament, but he was a consistent one, and consistency turned out to be the specific medicine her specific fear required. He asked her, formally and carefully, to allow him to court her properly. He came to Dolor's house, and said it with the gravity of a man who understood what he was asking, who was not asking for a guarantee, but for the opportunity to show her something over time. Maria had said yes with a composed face, and then gone into Dolor's kitchen and laughed until she cried, because the formality of it was so exactly like him, and so exactly what she had not known she needed. He brought her small things, not extravagant, not the kind of gifts that try to purchase affection, but thoughtful ones. A book of poems by a poet she had mentioned once in passing that she liked. A jar of the excellent honey sold by a beekeeper 2 towns over that she had admired at the general store, but considered too expensive. Wildflowers picked from the creek bank and arranged with a rough but genuine effort in a tin cup, left on the hotel desk one morning before she arrived. He taught Clara to read a compass, which Clara then carried everywhere and consulted on matters both navigational and philosophical. He taught her the names of the stars visible from Dusty Creek in autumn, which Clara memorized with the determination she brought to all things. He fixed the wobbly back step of the hotel that had been an inconvenience for 6 months without being asked, because he noticed it was wobbly. Maria, for her part, began to let herself want things. This was harder than it sounded. She had trained herself so thoroughly out of wanting that returning to it was an act of deliberate practice. She let herself want to see him in the evenings. She let herself look forward to the sound of his step on the hotel porch. She let herself picture, with increasing specificity and decreasing panic, what a future with him might look like. In October, 4 months after the crisis with Voss and Brody, on a cool Saturday evening when Clara was asleep at Dolor's house, and the stars were doing what stars did over the New Mexico desert, Nelson walked her to the bend in the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick and yellow and stood with her in the colored leaf quiet and said he loved her. He said it the way he said everything important, without preamble, without performance, looking at her directly. "I love you, Maria," he said. "I thought you should know." She looked at him in the tree-colored evening light and felt the walls come down in the last place they had been standing. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying not to for quite some time." "I know," he said, and now he did smile, the full, warm smile she had seen so rarely and valued so enormously because it was genuine and never performed. He kissed her then, in the cottonwood bend with the yellow leaves coming down around them, and it was careful and warm and entirely like him, and Maria felt something she had spent years trying to convince herself she could live without flooding back into her life. She did not try to convince herself of that anymore. The following months brought a change to Dusty Creek that nobody had quite seen coming, which was the visible and growing happiness of their Marshal. The town noticed. Towns like Dusty Creek had a social attentiveness to one another that people in cities never developed, because when you lived closely, other people's moods were a kind of weather you had to navigate. Nelson had always been well respected and liked, but he had been, even to his most charitable observers, a somewhat solitary man. The change that came over him as the winter progressed was subtle but unmistakable. A kind of warmth that had come into his usually calm face, a lightness in his manner. People smiled about it without making too much of a production. Dusty Creek was not, as a town, given to romantic drama, but the banker Mr. Fowler made a point of telling Ed Talbot that it was about time, and Mrs. Greer at the boarding house told 3 different people that she had known from the moment that woman arrived with her daughter that this was where the story was going. Dolor's was insufferably smug about it and made no effort to hide the fact. She announced at Sunday dinner one week in January that she expected to be given an important role in whatever celebration was eventually planned and would not hear otherwise. Nelson proposed in February 1883. He did it in the marshal's office, because the office was where their story had some of its most important moments, and he was a man who understood the significance of place. He had Clara's horse drawing still on the wall. He had a ring that had belonged to his mother, brought from a letter he had written to his brother in Austin requesting it. It was a small ring with a turquoise stone that was very much of the Southwest, and it fit Maria's hand as if it had been made for it. He did not kneel in the theatrical way. He stood in front of her and took her hand and said, "Will you marry me, Maria? You and Clara both. I'm asking both of you. I want to be the person who stays." Maria looked at the ring and at his face and at the horse picture on the wall and said yes. Clara, who had been sitting in the chair with her compass and her wooden horse and who had apparently been entirely aware of what was happening, said, "I knew it," with great satisfaction. They were married in April 1883 in the Dusty Creek Church, on a warm spring morning when the desert was flowering and the air smelled of something green and beginning. Dolers cried throughout the ceremony and denied it afterward. Ed Talbot served as Nelson's witness. Miss Crane from the schoolhouse decorated the church with paper flowers that she and her students had made, because fresh flowers in April in Dusty Creek were harder to come by than industry. Clara wore a white dress that Maria had made for her over 2 evenings, and which Clara announced was the most beautiful dress she had ever seen, and she carried the wooden horse throughout the ceremony because she said Marshal needed to see the wedding too. The whole town came. In a town of 300 people, a wedding for the Marshal was a civic event. Maria wore a dress the color of deep water, the closest thing to blue silk available in the territory, made by the seamstress on the south end of town from fabric that had arrived on the last supply wagon from Santa Fe. She walked up the aisle of the small wooden church with Clara on one side of her and Dolers on the other, and the full, overwhelming knowledge that she was not making a desperate decision or a frightened one. She was making a true one. Nelson stood at the front of the church in his best coat, his hair combed, his badge conspicuously not present because this was not an official occasion but a personal one. He watched her walk toward him with the expression she had come to understand as his face when he felt the most, which was not a dramatic face but a very still and honest one. He looked like a man who had decided something a long time ago and was watching it arrive. The minister said the words. They made the promises. When it was done, and Nelson kissed her with all of Dusty Creek watching and Dolers weeping without acknowledgement, Maria felt the last piece of the protective architecture she had built fall away, and knew she did not need it anymore. They held the reception outside the church, with tables brought from the hotel and food contributed by practically every family in town. There was music from 2 fiddles and a guitar, and the dancing went until the stars came fully out. Clara danced herself to exhaustion and was eventually found asleep in the corner on a folded blanket with the wooden horse tucked under her arm, having apparently decided that the celebration had gone entirely satisfactorily. That spring, Nelson began to speak more concretely about the land 12 miles northeast. He took Maria out to see it on a Sunday afternoon, both of them on horseback and Clara on the gentle older mare that the livery stable kept specifically for smaller riders. The land was everything he had described, gently rolling grassland with a good spring-fed creek running through the southern section, backed by a line of low hills that broke the wind. There was a small house on it already rough but solid, that the man Nelson paid to run the cattle had been maintaining. Maria stood in the spring grass and looked at the land and said, "Yes." Nelson looked at her. "To whatever you're thinking," she said. "Yes." The plan that developed over the summer was gradual and considered, which was how Nelson approached everything. He would not simply abandon the marshal's position without ensuring the town had a capable replacement. He spoke with the county commissioner and with Ed Talbot, who had been a deputy for 4 years and who was steady and intelligent and ready for more responsibility. The process of transitioning the marshal's office to Ed took the better part of a year, with Nelson providing oversight and guidance throughout. During that year, they began improving the house on the land. Nelson was handy with wood and stone, with the patient competence of a man who had built and repaired things throughout his adult life. He added 2 rooms to the small house, and rebuilt the chimney, and put in a proper kitchen with a good iron stove purchased from a catalog that arrived from Denver. Maria planted a kitchen garden along the east side of the house with the same methodical care she brought to everything, and by the following spring it was producing with remarkable enthusiasm. Clara, meanwhile, was growing in the way that 7-year-olds do, which is rapidly and in every direction at once. She had taken completely and naturally to Nelson's presence in their family with the simple pragmatism of children, who accept love when it is genuine and consistent without requiring it to justify itself. She called him Papa by June, and Nelson had received this with a gravity and warmth that made Maria have to look away for a moment, because the sight of it was more than her composed exterior could manage. She had written to her family in Santa Fe after the marriage, and her mother and her aunt had both sent letters of warm congratulation. Her mother, who had never said a word against Maria's decision to leave, and had supported her throughout the Robert years, said simply that she could hear from the letter that this was right, and that she expected to come and visit in the summer. She came in August, a sturdy woman in her 60s who had worked hard all her life and who assessed Nelson with the frank attention of a woman who had raised a daughter through difficult years and was determined to be satisfied before she endorsed anything. She was satisfied by the second day. On the third morning, she told Maria privately that he was a good man and that Maria should be kind to her luck. Maria said she intended to be. Her mother patted her hand and said that was enough. The transition to the land happened in the spring of 1884. Nelson officially handed the marshal's office to Ed Talbot on a Thursday morning with a handshake and a quiet conversation in the office that Maria was not privy to but which she understood, from the way both men looked afterward, to have been meaningful. He turned in his badge. He walked out of the office for the last time as its official occupant, and he stood in the morning sunlight of the Dusty Creek Main Street and took a breath of something that was not quite relief and not quite loss, but was exactly what comes at the end of a chapter lived fully. Maria was waiting for him at the wagon. Clara was already on the seat, the wooden horse in her lap, her compass around her neck, supervising the loading of the last of the household goods with the authority of a 7-year-old who has decided she is in charge. Nelson climbed up onto the seat and took the reins. They drove out of Dusty Creek in the morning light, toward the land, toward the house with the new rooms and the kitchen garden and the small herd of cattle that were waiting for proper attention. The town diminished behind them and the desert opened up ahead, wide and full of sky, and Maria sat beside her husband on the wagon seat with her shoulder touching his, and thought that the world had an enormous amount of room in it when you stopped trying to make yourself smaller to fit inside your own fear. The cattle operation grew slowly and with intention over the next 2 years. Nelson had a sound understanding of the land and the livestock, not theoretical but practical, built on the year he had run cattle before taking the marshal's job and the years since of watching other people run theirs. He made no reckless decisions. He expanded when it was sensible and held steady when it was not. He hired one ranch hand, a young man named Archero who came from a ranching family in the southern part of the territory, and who worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this since he could walk. Maria managed the household and the kitchen garden with the same practical energy she had brought to everything else, and found, to her considerable surprise, that she loved it in a way that the hotel work had never quite touched. She loved the rhythms of it, the growing things, the seasonal cycle, the way that the work was visible in its results in a way that desk work never quite was. She sold preserves and dried herbs to the general store in Dusty Creek through the summer and fall, which brought in a useful supplement to the cattle income. They went to Dusty Creek on Saturdays for supplies and to see dolers, and to check in with the community that was still their community in important ways. Ed Talbot was doing well as Marshal, and told them so with the contained pride of a man who was genuinely pleased with himself. Miss Crane had gotten married to a young lawyer who had set up practice in town, which Dusty Creek considered a good development. The railroad had indeed come through the eastern edge of the county, bringing new faces and new commerce. Clara had grown into a girl of 8 who was serious and funny in alternating measures, who could ride a horse with competence, who read everything she could lay hands on, who had strong opinions about almost every subject, and was not shy about expressing them. She had made peace with the wooden horse Marshal, eventually being retired to the windowsill of her room when a real horse came into her life. A small bay mare named Pearl, who Clara considered the most intelligent animal in the territory, and who returned Clara's devotion with the affectionate indifference of a well-cared-for horse. In 1885, Maria discovered she was expecting a child. She told Nelson on a Sunday morning when the house was quiet, and Clara had gone to the creek with Pearl and Archero to check on the cattle in the south pasture. She sat across the breakfast table from him and said it plainly, because she was a plain-speaking woman, and watched his face change in the way she had not quite seen it change before. He stood up from the table and came around and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his large, work-rough hands and said nothing for a moment, just held her hands and looked at her with an expression that was too full to be contained in any smaller gesture. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. He brought her hands up and pressed them against his face for a moment, which was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen him do, and she loved him with a ferocity in that moment that made everything previous feel like a preliminary. Clara, when told, received the news with the thoughtful seriousness of someone consulting an internal authority on a complex matter. Then she said that if it was a brother she intended to teach him to ride and to read a compass as early as possible, and if it was a sister she intended to do the same things, and either way she had a great many plans, and she hoped the baby was ready for them. The baby arrived in February 1886, on a cold night when the desert was as quiet as it ever got, with the doctor from Dusty Creek in attendance and Dollar's there, having arrived 2 days early because Dollar's instincts about these matters were impeccable. He was a boy, born in the early hours of the morning, large and loud and dark-haired, and Nelson held him with the careful, bewildered tenderness of a man encountering something that had rearranged all his internal arrangements. They named him Daniel James Hawkins. James was Nelson's brother's name, and the choice of it made Nelson's brother, when notified by letter, respond with a letter so enthusiastic that it nearly tore itself. Clara inspected Daniel with the attention of a naturalist encountering a new specimen, and announced that he was, so far as she could tell, good, and that she would begin his education as soon as he was big enough to hold a pencil. The family that the Dusty Creek parlor gossips had apparently seen coming, though neither Nelson nor Maria had, took shape in those years on the land northeast of town with a completeness that Maria found herself astonished by. She had not asked for this. She had not planned it. She had planned, in fact, for a much smaller and more defended version of her life, had told herself that protection was more important than joy, and that the practical management of loneliness was the responsible choice. She understood now, as she stood in the kitchen garden on a July morning in 1886, with Daniel strapped to her chest in a cloth carrier, and Clara and Pearl visible in the far pasture, and the sound of Nelson working on the barn addition coming from behind the house, that the practical management of loneliness was an expertise she had been very glad to lose. There were hard days still, because this was life, and life in the territory was not soft. There were cattle lost to a bad winter in 1887 that set them back and required some careful fiscal management. There was a season when the spring dried up and they had to dig deeper for water, and it was expensive and exhausting. There was a summer of grasshoppers that devastated Maria's kitchen garden, and left her quietly furious in a way she handled by planting everything again from scratch. There was a morning when Nelson rode to Dusty Creek to look at a matter that Ed Talbot had consulted him about, because old expertise is sometimes needed even when you are no longer official, and he was gone longer than expected, and Maria stood at the window of the house in the late afternoon watching the road and feeling the old fear stir in her, not as strongly as before, not with the destructive power it had once had, but still present, still recognizable. He rode back in the golden hour of the evening, when the light made the desert look like something from a painting. He came through the gate and unsaddled his horse and walked up to the house and saw her in the window and lifted a hand in greeting, and the fear settled back down to wherever it lived now. She went to the door. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Everything's fine," he said. "Took longer than I thought. Ed is handling it fine." He stepped up onto the porch and looked at her face in the evening light. "Were you worried?" "A little," she said honestly. He put his hand to her face in the way he had developed over the years, the light, specific touch that meant he saw her. "I'm here," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll always come home," he said. She nodded. She believed him. Not because he had promised it without understanding the cost, but because she understood exactly what he meant when he said it, the full weight and intention of it. And she had years of evidence that, when this man said something, he meant it in every corner. In 1888, Daniel was 2 years old and growing into a personality of considerable force, with his father's steady eyes and his mother's will, a combination that Clara observed with the sage amusement of a sibling who had gotten there first. The cattle operation had recovered from the hard winter and was doing well. The house had been expanded twice, and now had 5 rooms and a proper porch that faced west for the evening light. Maria was 34 years old and felt, in the way that can only be felt by someone who has known the alternative, exactly the fullness of her own life. Nelson, at 40, had the kind of face that had earned its lines, deep-set and weathered and permanently warm in the way that warmth becomes structural after enough years of being genuine. He had lost none of his quietness, but had gained a kind of ease that he had not entirely had in the Marshal years, the ease of a man living exactly the life that fit him. They had been through enough, the two of them, to understand that happiness was not a destination but a practice, something you made in the daily work of showing up for each other with honesty and care, and the willingness to stay when staying was hard, and also when it was simply ordinary. One evening in the fall of 1888, when Daniel was asleep and Clara was in her room reading by lamplight, and the house had that deep, specific quiet of a family resting, Maria sat on the west-facing porch and watched the sunset do what sunsets did over the New Mexico desert, which was to make the whole enormous sky into a statement about the relationship between fire and peace. Nelson came and sat beside her. He brought 2 cups of coffee, which she accepted. They sat together in the way that people sit together when they have been sitting together long enough that the silence between them is not empty but full. "I was going to leave," she said. He looked at her. He knew what she meant. "That morning in the office," she said, "I had everything packed. I had told myself it was right. I was so certain." "I know," he said. "What would you have done?" she asked. "If I had left?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was answering honestly rather than quickly. "I would have missed you for a very long time," he said, "and I would have stayed here." She nodded. "I know." "Do you regret being afraid?" he asked. She thought about it. "No," she said. "I think the fear was telling me the truth in its way, that this mattered, that you mattered. Things that don't matter don't frighten you like that." He reached over and took her hand, which was a thing he had done thousands of times now and which still felt, each time, like something chosen. "Clara asked me something yesterday," he said. Maria looked at him. "She asked me if I had always wanted to be a farmer," he said. "That's what she called it, a farmer," Maria smiled. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I had been a marshal for a long time and that I had thought it was what I was supposed to do. And then I told her that sometimes the thing you are supposed to do is not the same as the thing that makes your life complete." He paused. "She said that was very philosophical, And then she told me Pearl had gotten into the garden again. Maria laughed, which was a sound that had come more easily over the years, and which Nelson still looked at when it happened with the uncomplicated pleasure of a man who never took it for granted. The prairie dark came down over the land, and the stars appeared one after another in the enormous New Mexico sky, and the house behind them held its quiet rooms with their sleeping children and their years of accumulated life. The coffee was warm in Maria's hands, and the man beside her was as steady and real as the ground under the porch, and she sat in the full, close dark of a night that asked nothing of her except to be in it, and she was in it, entirely. There were letters from her mother in Santa Fe, who came to visit every other summer and spoiled Daniel with sweets, and told Clara she was the finest young woman in the territory with a conviction that no evidence could shake. There were letters from Nelson's brother in Austin, who had not yet managed to make the trip but wrote faithfully and at length, and who Maria felt she knew from the letters as well as she knew most people she had met in person. There were, eventually, more children. In 1890, a second son, Thomas, who arrived in May with a calm that was entirely his own, and who grew into a boy of gentle temperament who was happiest with animals, and spent more hours than anyone could account for simply sitting with the horses in a state of mutual contentment. In 1893, a daughter, Rosa, who was small and fierce, and who could argue a position into the ground before she was 4, which Nelson observed with the specific pride of a man who recognized a quality that he admired even when it was inconvenient. The family filled the house in the way that families do, with noise and mess, and the particular, irreplaceable texture of people who know each other completely. Clara grew up. She attended the Dusty Creek School as long as it could teach her, and then was sent, at 15, to a girls' academy in Santa Fe that Maria's family helped support, and that Nelson paid for with the careful, long-term planning of a man who takes his commitments seriously. She wrote letters home with the enthusiastic frequency of someone who is discovering the world and wants everyone she loves to know about all of it. She came home for summers and for Christmas and grew more herself with each return, sharp and funny and deeply kind, exactly who she had always been but larger. She came home from the academy at 18 with a young woman's confidence and a young woman's ideas, and she spent that summer on the ranch helping with everything and arguing with Daniel, who was 4 years her junior and already developing his own formidable positions on most subjects. One evening she sat with Maria on the porch and said, out of a quiet that had been holding something for a while, "I remember when we were going to leave." Maria looked at her daughter's profile in the evening light, this woman who had been a small girl with a wooden horse and a trust that had never wavered. "I remember," Maria said. "I was so sad," Clara said, "but I didn't know how to say it, I just went very quiet." "I know," Maria said, "I saw. And then Marshal Nelson said that thing." Clara paused. "I've thought about that a lot over the years, what he said." "What do you think about it?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "I think he was talking to both of us," she said. "I think he was telling you what we both needed to hear, that we deserved someone who stayed." Maria felt the old warmth of that morning move through her, not painful anymore, not shadowed by the fear that had surrounded it, just the warmth of a true thing remembered. "He was," she said. Clara turned to look at her mother. "I want that," she said simply. "When the time comes, I want that." "You will have it," Maria said, with the certainty of a woman who has learned that certainty is not always arrogance. "Because you know what it looks like." Clara nodded. She looked out at the land, at the last of the evening light on the hills, at the sky that was beginning its nightly argument between blue and dark. "I know what it looks like," she agreed. Nelson came out onto the porch then with Daniel at his heels and Thomas somewhere behind, and the evening became itself, a family in the last light of a day, comfortable in the large and ordinary miracle of being together. Maria looked at Nelson across the porch, and he looked back at her with the simple, direct attention that had not changed in all the years from that first morning in the doorway when she had stood terrified in her own life, and he had said the thing that was true. She was not afraid anymore. She was not the woman who packed her trunks and told herself she was being practical when she was being afraid. She was not the woman who believed that protection and love were the same thing or that walls were the same thing as strength. She was Maria Hawkins, formerly Hale, wife and mother and grower of kitchen gardens, and seller of preserves and keeper of a family on a piece of New Mexico land that was as much hers as anyone could call a piece of earth their own. She was a woman who had learned, the hard way, and then the good way, that staying was itself an act of courage when done for the right reasons by the right people. The stars came out over the desert one by one, the same stars that Nelson had named for Clara on evenings when she was small, the same stars that threw their light down across the land and the house and the family that had built itself here in the years since a wagon had rolled into Dusty Creek with a woman who was not looking for love and a child who was quietly looking for exactly that. Nelson sat down beside her on the porch rail and she leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her in the easy, permanent way of a man who has been doing this long enough that it is simply the shape of things. And they watched their children and their land and their sky in the gathering dark, and the story that had been threatened so many times by fear and history and old wounds was fully, completely, and irrevocably theirs. It was a life. It was their life. And it was good.